do we have 3 volunteers to kind of model more facility? And what we'll do here is what is a typical exercise. You kind of have a sheet. You can do this exercise again if you want, or you can kind of do it in your class. The full exercise takes about 50 minutes or so. But you take one of the, you can use other issues, but you do 3 approaches, and we do 10 minutes on, so 10 minutes of facilitation, and then 8 minutes of debrief. So we do this with a new, this is, I figured out the last couple of years, one of the reasons why my program works so well. You know, I have 15 new students and at least 15 returning students. So I just did, after the first 2 weeks of class, we have an all-day workshop. So we have a 9 to 5 workshop that we did last Saturday, right? And so the new students will learn from training, but all the experienced students come back, right? So I do what I just did, talk about facilitator responsibilities, basic moves, and then we do this exercise. But this exercise, we have 3 new students in each, so 1 for each approach, and then typically at least 1 or 2, sometimes 3 experienced students. So it's a small group. So they do the 10 minutes facilitation, and then they do 8 minutes of debrief. Like, what questions did you ask, and how did that work, and that kind of. But what that also does, I didn't realize until a few years ago, that I'm putting the senior associates, the second semester students, in the place that they're the experts, right? As I'm walking around hearing, they're repeating what I said in training and that kind of stuff, right? But then I think they take so much ownership of the program because of that. That I'm putting my trust in them, of them training these new students, right? And you see the pride in it. So that this model of having this 2-semester, I don't know if you're able to do the 2-semester thing or not, you know. But the fact that I rely on my experienced students to train the new students, I think really builds up kind of pride in the work and the senior associates, right? In a way that really kind of self-perpetuates itself, right? As we go. So, do I have 3 volunteers? Let me couch it this way to make it a little bit easier. We need you as a facilitator to make lots of mistakes, because mistakes is what really we learn from, right? So if you're worried about making a mistake, that's exactly what I need, right? Because I can tell students, no, don't play the expert role, but it's a lot easier to bring that lesson down when someone plays the expert role, and then we can kind of explain how that didn't work so well. Right? So don't be worried about doing badly, because we need you to do badly so we can all learn from it. Did that work? No?
Well, it convinced me to do
that. All right. We got 2, right? So 1 more. Now the Americans are going for it. You're too engaged in the topic, is that what it is?
I'm not even engaged in the topic because I don't think that any of
So you want to be a participant, huh?
No. I'll facilitate if you want me to. I kind of am already kind of trained, so I feel like it's maybe not the best for me to do it.
Right. Well, no, but modeling good facilitation is always good.
Okay.
It'll be interesting because you're training more on conflict resolution.
Yeah, I'm more trained in like mediation.
Yeah, so it'll be interesting to see the difference.
Yeah.
Okay, y'all have a preference in terms of the approach. So the first approach, so let me set up the topic, right? So at least in the United States, this is probably generally international issue as well, right? But with obesity rates, if you look at kind of the last 30 years, increase in obesity rates. I know in Colorado, we're actually in really good shape in Colorado, literally and figuratively. And I think we're number 1 in terms of fitness, but even Colorado, the obesity rates compared to 30 years ago have skyrocketed, right? So generally it's kind of seen by a lot of people as an epidemic, like things have to change in a way. There's lots of information in terms of the impact on society, in terms of kind of public health costs and those type of things. And if you're obese as a child, you tend to be obese as an adult and all those type of things. So generally we kind of start, I think, from this common ground, like, hey, something's got to change, right? We can't kind of stay like this, right? So then this is the 3 approaches. I'd like to do these kind of approaches in some ways where each approach focuses on a specific stakeholder, right? That they should really take a lot more responsibility for this, right? This in particular kind of reinforces the notion I talked about earlier that it's not about talking through and then picking one approach. We're not assuming only one of these entities. Now, clearly, all 3 have some responsibility here, right? But it structures the conversation. What happens when we really focus in on what is the role of schools here? What is the role of government, right? And spend some dedicated time to think about that, right? Because one of the other aspects of the NIF model that I think works really well, with general issues, what tends to happen, especially like with legislature and policy, is one solution is brought up. Let's do this, right? But if it's a wicked problem, that solution is going to have flaws, right? And as a society, we're really good at pointing out flaws, right? Especially in an adversarial system, right? So we have a problem, we all agree it's a problem. People say, let's do this to solve the problem. That gets torn apart. Okay, never mind, right? Let's do this to solve the problem. That gets torn apart. Okay, never mind. Let's see. So we never do anything because we're almost like waiting for the magic bullet. We're waiting for the solution that has no flaws when it doesn't exist, right? So what an NIF approach does is, okay, here's a common problem. Here's 3 broad solutions to it. Again, each one has flaws, right? But there's also that notion that since we're looking at 3, and hopefully those 3 kind of cover a lot of the ground, right? Doesn't leave a huge kind of potential solution out, that we recognize by the end of it, well, you know what? None of them are great, but we got to do something, right? So that it's able to kind of get past that hump of waiting for the magic bullet in a sense. That makes sense? So that's why this conversation, we're not making the argument that really only one of these entities should do, but let's spend some time talking through what happens if we really focus in on one of those entities, right? No, if we're doing this for real, so we'd set up the problem, kind of establish, we don't have a video for this one or anything like that, establish, child ABC is a key term, and then we're gonna spend, about 10 minutes on each approach, facilitating, which is not long enough to really have a full conversation with it, but we're just getting practice facilitating. And then we'll spend some time kind of debriefing, talking about specific interventions, and I'll be trying to take some notes as we do that. So do we want to do approach 1, approach 2, approach 3? Is that right? Or does someone have an approach that they'd like to do? So what we would do, and I know you just got this, right? We have third approach.
Sure. Let's do this.
Government.
Alright, hello. So I will be covering the third approach. The third approach looks at more of a government role, more of a policy role to this problem, looking at implying taxes on junk foods, more regulation, also doing more publicly funded parks and programs. So just kind of opening this up now, what do you all think about this approach?
Well, I think that the government has a quite important economic incentives to engage in the process. At first, it has resources and abilities. And the second thing is that the government has to manage the problem, the financial consequences of the city. So I think the general answer should be that yes, we have to expect government to engage.
So overall, you're saying that you feel like there's economic incentive. Is that correct?
Yes, well, we may divide it into
Into the 2 areas.
Yeah. First are the costs which the government has to spend on public health care, and the second thing is the possibility of using market-based instruments, for example, taxes.
Yeah, great. Thank you for your contribution. What do others think? Yes.
I think that having the government take a stronger role makes a lot of sense because the one thing they have the resources to do that individuals and schools don't is market this as a real problem. If a parent tells their child one thing, it's a family contained matter. If a school does something, there's going to be back and forth, but even then it's fairly contained. The government has the resources to market this as a broad issue with real broad consequences that where you can see that even if somebody else is taking this action, in the long run, it's going to impact you because if they are, say, in poverty and they're eating bad food, they're going to have health problems, which you as a taxpayer then end up with the bill for via Medicare and Medicaid. I think also that's particularly helpful if the government wants to take the approach of increasing regulation when it comes to advertising junk food to children. Because just a single family or a school is going to have a real hard time convincing people that this is a potentially bad thing on par with, say, alcohol or cigarettes, whereas the government has the resources to really kind of push that viewpoint. So I think it makes strictly from a resource point of view, a lot of steps for the government to up their game on this one.
All right. So what you're really saying is that you feel like they have the resources, they have the ability to make this a greater, broader issue, and to use their resources in terms of taxation and regulation to further push that agenda. How do others feel about this issue?
I agree, but I'm just curious, which government? I mean, the federal government or the state government?
Right? That's an important question.
It just varies so much from state to state.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm thinking of Herman Park, and I don't know how many people know that Herman Park is actually not a state-funded park, right?
Interesting.
It's a private park that is open to the public, but it's private. So, or that, the other big park that I used to live at was donated by this really wealthy lady to the state.
You raise a really great point. Also, in terms of regulation, so you can have federal regulation, state regulation, city regulation, like the ban of large sodas in New York City, right?
Which went over really well.
Yeah, exactly. So things like that. So I think Raquel brings up a really good point. So what do you all think about that? Where do we draw this line of regulation, or is it gray?
Well, I think we should use the subsidiarity principle in this. Yeah. So what the I'm not used to federal state, but those things which should be solved better at federal level should be solved. So I think the taxes can be such an issue. Whereas I think the management of landscape and parks and so on, I cannot imagine that the federal government would deal with this problem.
So you're thinking more federal taxation regulation, and then more localized funding for things such as parks and
Yeah, I think
municipalities?
for each level, each type of government is so one has to choose.
Yeah. Mindy, did I see? No.
No, I didn't hear something.
Oh, okay.
I was thinking how great it would be if we could tax junk food. Then I was so wondering, I was thinking about the McDonald's lobby, like how hard that would be.
Well, I mean, we tax alcohol, we tax tobacco. In Colorado, we tax marijuana. So these sin taxes, right? And the idea of the sin tax is it's a win-win, right? Either they use less of the product because it's too expensive, but if they use the product, then we get additional taxes to do good things, right? So the idea of taxing junk food to subsidize healthy food, right? So the salad in McDonald's is as cheap as a double cheeseburger. The problem is, for me, I know my parents owned a daycare center in Houston as I grew up in a pretty low-income part of town, so they had a lot of government programs, and every year she would go to a training about what kind of food they had to give to the kids, and she said every year the training changed, right? So she'd come home, it's like, oh, milk's bad now, can't have milk, next year, oh, no, milk's good, so that line of what's junk food and what's not junk food.
We're food lobbyists.
When it's a political issue, right, so to what degree, what do you say is junk food that gets taxed? To what degree do they add vitamin C to a potato chip, so now they say it's healthy, So I think the implementation of that's going to be a little bit more difficult than, tax junk food and, healthy food, right? What's junk and what's healthy is going to be a politicized issue, but I'm not saying it's not worth trying to figure that out.
What about some of these trade-offs? Are there any trade-offs on there that you are particularly drawn to or want to discuss?
I think with one issue we're dealing with Fort Collins is we have a new tax coming up, like an extension of it's called the Building on Basics for like large programs. So they come up with a list of programs and we vote. So outside of the budget, there are new cool things. And one of them is a recreation center for the south part of town. Now in Fort Collins, north part is a little poor. The south part is a little bit more well off. North part already has some public recreation centers, right? The south part does not, so we need a recreation center, but since there's not one, we have several businesses that are health clubs, right? So if they build a recreation center on the south part of town, it's probably going to cause some of those health clubs to close, because now the government is providing a service that is the private industry, So I can see some of those tensions in a sense of, if we're saying now it's a government responsibility to provide places to exercise, and sports programs and leagues and stuff like that, then that means the private industry, you're taking that away from private industry, right? So I think that's going to be tough to see how that kind of plays out.
I think that's an interesting point you make, but also it adds choice, right?
Yeah, but then for the people who can pay for these sport programs are not really the people who are needing them. And there is a lot of people who, well, they just, I'm thinking that more parkways, exercise equipment in a small neighborhood, especially in neighborhoods who are really low income, I think that should be also something that the government could help on doing that. Another thing also that I think the food desert also is an area that nobody speaks, and I mean I really didn't know much about food deserts until I went to USDA on a fellowship, and then I learned about this term, and I came back to Houston because we don't see food deserts. When I look at the map, I was really surprised how many food deserts we have here in the city. So I think that's a role also for the local, state, and even the federal role.
Others?
Well, I agree with Maria. I was trying to move to a cheaper apartment. So then I don't remember which ward it is in Houston, but I just map it because I don't have a car. So I was like, where's the grocery store? There is a ward in Houston that has no grocery stores within its borders. Absolutely none. And I was like, I can't live there. I don't know how people live there. So that's a food desert that we have, right, in Houston. And then, but also I think, well, I don't know, I just, it's not only the parks for poor neighborhoods, but the safety. Like, is it really safe for them to go outside? Do their parents feel safe for the children to be playing? Are there drug dealers? Are they going to be shot? So if you don't have that safety, then it's very hard for parents to say, oh yeah, let me just send my child to the park.
Others who we haven't heard from yet?
About a minute or so.
I'm running out of steam.
Oh, I guess not right.
Okay.
That's a good starting point. Okay. So,
I felt fun.
she has a lot of experience kind of coming in, right? So, I noticed for sure, like, most of us were liking this approach, right? So, one of the interventions you made is, what do you think about those trade-offs, right?
Yeah.
So, that was kind of a transition question and a push on that.
Oh, and I think that's a good point. It's like once you do it a couple times, I think you feel a lot more comfortable than like completely stressed out. Yeah.
So, all three of y'all chose to stand, right? I don't know if y'all have. The reason you made that choice was you more comfortable. I mean, y'all are used to being teachers, probably, so you're used to kind of standing in front of the room in a sense, right? Do you normally, if you do mediations?
No,
mediation is normally just between two people, right? Or
yeah, I'll like set up the table so everyone's kind of equal.
Yeah.
But so I do kind of like deliberative style in my classes a lot.
Okay.
So that's why I felt more comfortable standing. Because I kind of treated it like that.
Yeah. The distinction between mediation and deliberation, I'd be curious if you have any kind of initial thoughts with that. I have some, but I mean, do you see a difference between kind of a public the public showing up and a mediation? At least in my mind, a mediation is normally, it's more stakeholders, right?
Yeah.
People are coming in with a specific stake that is a little bit different.
So I'm also like a trained like focus group facilitator.
Okay.
So I see more overlap between deliberation and focus groups than I do with mediation.
Okay.
Even though I think all three of them like share a lot of the same characteristics of how you facilitate them. But yeah, I just feel as you're just trying to like gather opinions more so, and that's why I see a lot of overlap between deliberation and focus groups. But then you're also trying to get to some sort of consensus, or at least share different perspectives, which then you get more of that mediation. So.
Other thoughts or questions about that one? We all like government.
Do you bring your own ideas as you are doing this? Like, actually, she just finished, and then can she kind of like do a question again based on something that she she's told that we didn't cover? Can she?
Yeah, I mean, again, it becomes, it's a finite distinction or gray area distinction between, are you asking that question because this is an important issue to this topic we need to talk about, or something I think is important, right? So you're trying to distinguish in a sense that you're not asking that question because that's what you think, right? You're asking that question from a process perspective that this is an important part of the conversation that's missing, right? So that's where, and those two, that distinction sometimes is not a distinction in some senses, right? But you don't want your own opinion to come out too much, right, that you're pushing. So you don't want to say, right, I told several stories here, like in my city, you would want to do that as a facilitator, right? Of kind of, here's an example for me, unless it's really the examples just to kind of help them think through something else in some way.
And Maria had to step out during it, but there are other ways that do not put your personal self to move the topic. Like you can point to the placemat, right, and say, are there other questions on here or topics that you think are important? So that's kind of doing what you're saying, but maybe without putting your own biases.
We talked earlier when you weren't here about the empty chair. We sometimes put an empty chair in the middle of the room and kind of tell people, if you want, you can bring someone to put it in that chair, right? To bring it, or as a facilitator, you can, right? So like I was just kind of joking. We all kind of like government, right? So we didn't have the person here that's like, government bad, Texas bad, kind of, so you could have brought that in, right? What would someone say here that feels government is already doing too much and taxes are too high, that we're relying too often on government to solve our problems, right? So there's a lot of mechanisms as a facilitator. If you feel a voice is missing, you don't want to fill that voice with your voice, right? That void with your voice. But there's ways you could do to kind of open the conversation up so that gets filled in some ways. So with this one, kind of do that same mechanism. What were some of the underlying values relevant to this topic? Again, we tend to explicitly talk about, right? But what are some of the things that we care about that were relevant to this topic? Health, right?
Yeah.
So clearly health, both in terms of individual health. I mean, the framing of this as childhood obesity is important, right? Because it's that notion that children don't have as much power to make their own choices, right?
Yeah.
So it becomes a little bit more of a societal responsibility in a sense, in some ways. But then that goes directly into kind of another value of kind of valuing parents having control, right? It seems to be violating something when we tell parents how to parent, right? Yeah. So the freedom, parental, I don't know, there's not really a phrase that we use, right? Parental freedom or parental kind of authority in a way that we recognize. So that right there is this tension, right? Like, oh man, we feel we need to do something to help these kids, but then we also don't want to violate that parental authority or parental freedom or whatever. Right? So those are these two. What else?
I think human value or human worth. I think it came up in both approach 1 and approach 2.
In terms of
like the stigmatization and like Jerome talked about like bullying and that deals. I mean,
so that compassion might be part of that, right?
Potentially.
By the way, one of my favorite probing questions is talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah.
That's a probing question, right? Someone says something, it's interesting, but they seem to be they finish talking. Talk a little bit more about that. Is this a great probing question? Right? Keep talking, right? So that human value, that compassion, that.
Recognizing that it's not just numbers, but that these are actual
real people,
individuals with value and worth and feelings, and that you need to respect and think about what sort of how those regulations might impact that individual.
Okay.
Yeah, and going along with that, I think understanding education as a holistic process instead of, a number on a test, right? So recognizing that there's a lot more that goes into educating the student.
Yeah, so a lot of times when we do work on curriculum, that tension between the kind of the basics or STEM even, and the whole child, right? I remember we did actually a big STEM project for the governor's office, 2007, way back when, and it was a lot of funding to kind of increase STEM, right? So then they split up the state into 6 different districts, and they hired someone in each district, and they hired someone in my district from an education, in my college, and then they asked me to help run the public process. And it was funny because they had kind of these designs, how to engage the public, and then I obviously tweaked mine a little bit. But the end of our design was supposed to be this: okay, now that we've had this conversation, do you think we should expand STEM? And I said, that's a horrible question. Like, of course, like who's going to be against STEM, right? But the question we need to ask is, are you in support of increasing STEM, even if that means we have to give up time for art or for for those type of things, Because again, that's the question. If we're going to do more STEM, we're doing less of something else, or we're spending more time in class, or maybe we're combining things, right? Which kind of came up in a way, right? But there was, that's that notion that there is that tension between really getting good at the basics and getting better test scores, right? Because we test science and math and English. We don't really test PE and nutrition classes or civics. Civic education doesn't have a test, right? That's a controversy going on in Colorado in a sense of some civic teachers want there to be a test, right? Because if there's a test, then it becomes a more important subject, right? But then if there's a test, then they have to teach, then there's a specific, so you lose innovation and flexibility. Right, like a standardized test for civic education or for government, right? There's not one right now in Colorado. There might be in Texas, right? But, there's interesting tensions in a way of, because if we have a test, then we have to measure it, right? And some things like, well, I don't know how to measure this, right? But there does seem to be a bias in K-12 now that if you measure it, it's more important.
Right.
So you don't have a test in social studies?
Not really. Not Colorado. It's not that, we have English, we have math, and we have science starts a little bit later.
They're still teaching the subject, but it's not being
there's just not standardized testing, right?
Yeah.
So then there's this controversy because some teachers want the standardized testing because if there's standardized testing, more resources come with that. But then other ones saying, no, once we have standardized testing, then all of a sudden. Well, this is the other tension to think about. We'll get into this with clarity management more tomorrow, right? Testing means standardization, right? Which means consistency, which means everyone's doing the same thing. There's good stuff about that, right? But on the flip side of that is there's less innovation. There's less flexibility, right? So in some ways, if every teacher is teaching it the same way across the state, right? There's some good things about that, right?
Sure.
That means if you transition, you transfer from one school to another, well, you're kind of on the same thing. You've got the same textbook, and then then that also means that individual teachers, most teachers go into teaching not because they want to control the classroom, right? You want to have control over your syllabus. You want to be able to have some flexibility, right? So that consistency versus flexibility is a huge tension we deal with in K-12, right? That is often not discussed well, right? Because some people just see the advantages of consistency and the advantages of flexibility and don't see the drawbacks of each. Right? So that's something that we really push with our work with schools is to help them really think about that in a sense. Other values in there, so we have like health, we have kind of a humanity and compassion, we have kind of education as holistic, right? Probably, then we have the flip side, which is education is rigor, or education focused on the basics, that you'll get. We didn't get much of that here, I kind of mentioned it briefly, but a lot of people saying, hey, we're falling behind the world in science. Approach one from today, right, would go against spending time on nutrition, right? No, we need to spend time on math and science, and we need to kind of catch up to the world in that. We need to improve our test scores. And if they're outside running around, they're not doing it right now. Part of your response, which again is a good example of, no, that's a false tension. We need to transcend it because by running around, their minds are sharper and they're able to do better in class, right?
They can count their jumping jacks.
Yeah, so that's Aristotle, right? That it's got to be both, right? We can't just kind of do hard subjects all day long. And they need to kind of have the education, the exercise. So that's good example of identifying tension, but then also kind of rejecting that tension and saying, well, actually, they work together in some ways.
I think also the cost to the taxpayers is also an important thing here. Because, well, we are paying already enough taxes in this country. So
yeah, it's very easy to come up with government programs, right?
Yeah.
The recognition that, okay, if we're going to spend money on building public parks and those type of things, then we're either increasing taxes or we're doing less of something. Right?
How often do you have
so that's
people
the tension.
who are willing to increase taxes almost on anything?
Right.
I never do.
Equality is probably one of the equality and justice, right? The part of it came up, especially the approach one, right? That we want people to make better decisions, but it's a lot easier to make better decisions when you have money, right? It's pretty easy for me to feed my kids well because we have the resources for my wife to be home all day, right? So she can spend the time to kind of go shopping and make things, right? But if we're both working, or if there's only one single parent, going to McDonald's and getting the dollar menu would probably be something we do a lot more often in a sense, right? So there's equity, kind of justice issues kind of involved in this on how we're doing. Just the money and the time that good food takes in some ways, right? So again, that's that same with this issue, we come up with all the list of things that we care about, and then we start recognizing that there's some tensions between it. If we focus on this, then we're giving up on this, right? Or we're pushing back on that. So then we try to arrange the conversation. So that's what the conversation is how do we take on these tensions? And how do we transcend them, or how do we kind of make the tough choice between them, or those type of things.